When I think of Ireland, I think of silence, not the absence of sound, but the living quiet that breathes beneath every hill and hedge. The wind drifts through the grass like a memory, and the sea hums endlessly against the western rocks. Even the stones seem to hold a pulse, as if the land itself remembers everything that has ever happened upon it. It is in this living silence that the Banshee's voice is born. Her cry is part of the rhythm of Ireland, as old as the rivers and as restless as the sky. I grew up hearing that her wail could be heard on nights when the air grew thick with sorrow, a sound that came before death, though not to cause it. To me, it always sounded more like love than fear, like someone saying farewell softly in the dark. The stories say she wanders unseen, her cry floating over bogs and through valleys, carried by the wind from one heart to another. Some hear her and tremble, others weep without knowing why. But to those who understand, she is not a curse. She is a companion of endings, a voice to remind us that grief itself is a form of grace. I've often wondered whether the land created her or whether she created the land's sorrow. Either way, she belongs to it. She is the echo of every mother's lament, every lover's goodbye, every unspoken prayer for the departed. She is Ireland's breath at twilight, singing its long, gentle song of remembrance. Long before the word banshee was ever written down, the people spoke of the being Sida, the woman of the fairy mound. In those days, the Irish believed that the land was alive, and that its hollow hills and green rises were the homes of the Awas Sea, the shining ones. These were not playful sprites, but ancient beings of light and shadow, as old as the air itself. Among them were the women who keened for the dead, the mourners whose duty it was to sing the soul across the threshold from life to death. The Cowie Nead, their lament, was said to open the gates between worlds. Their voices could make the living weep and the dead rise one last time to listen. It's said that one of these fairy women grew too close to the human heart. She began to weep for mortals, to mourn them with the same tenderness she once reserved for her own kind. Her voice softened, and her sorrow deepened until she could no longer return to the bright world of the sea. She stayed, bound to the human world by compassion, and so the Banshee was born, half spirit, half sorrow, forever hovering at the edges of our lives. Generations later, her story lingered in every county. People began to say that her cry would come before the death of someone great or deeply loved. She was not feared as much as respected. Her song was a warning, yes, but also a mercy. It gave time to prepare, to say goodbye, to make peace. In the flicker of candlelight at old wakes, I sometimes think the mourners heard her in the wind outside, and maybe she heard them too, the living and the dead, joined by a single voice. Every Irish family has a story, and some of them are shadowed by her. The old tales say that certain lineages, the O'Neills, the O'Briens, the O'Connors, and others whose bloodlines run deep into the soil, are followed by their own banshee. She watches over them as both witness and mourner, appearing only when one of their own is about to cross the final threshold. When I was younger, an old man from County Clare told me that his grandmother once saw her. It was late in autumn, the air damp and still. She heard a faint crying outside the cottage, so she stepped to the window and looked out. There, beneath the willow by the stream, stood a woman in grey, her hair long and loose, her face hidden behind it. The sound she made was not loud, but it carried, soft as the sea and twice as endless. The next morning, a letter arrived from Dublin. Her eldest brother had passed quietly in his sleep. I asked if his grandmother had been afraid. The man shook his head. "Afraid?" he said. "No. She said it was a kindness. He didn't go alone." That story stayed with me. It reminded me that the Banshee's role is not one of cruelty, but of care. To hear her is to be reminded that someone or something still remembers you. The cry is not meant to harm, it is meant to hold. It is love transformed into sound. Even today, some families claim they still hear her, faint and far off, when a loved one is near the end. They open their windows to let her voice through, believing that it helps the dying find their way home. In that moment, she becomes what she has always been, not a monster, but a guide. The Banshee is a mystery of mirrors. She takes whatever form the heart gives her. To those who live in fear, she appears as a pale spectre, thin, hollow-eyed, her hands like branches in the wind. To those who grieve, she seems gentle, her sorrow as human as their own. To the poets, she is beauty itself, tragic and luminous, a figure woven from mist and moonlight. People have seen her in countless guises. Some say she walks by rivers, washing blood-stained clothes, the garments of those soon to die. Others see her in the guise of an old woman combing her long hair with a silver comb. Some hear her but never see her at all, only the air trembling, the birds going quiet, and the sudden stillness that falls before her cry. I once met a fisherman on the western coast who swore he heard her near the cliffs one night. He said the sea had been calm, the stars clear, when a sound rose from the shore, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was a sound that seemed to know his name. I didn't run, he told me. I listened, bare, and I cried. I didn't know why, but I cried. A week later, word reached him that his brother had drowned in another part of the coast. The banshee does not belong to one shape or story. She is what she must be to each listener, a reminder of the thin veil between worlds, the breath between love and loss. Sometimes she is seen, sometimes only felt, but always she leaves behind silence, a silence that feels like reverence. The banshee's cry is not one sound, it is many. Each person who has heard it describes it differently, as if the sound changes shape depending on who listens. Some say it begins like a sigh and rises into a wail that pierces the stillness of night. Others claim it sounds more like singing, a melody that trembles with sadness, yet carries an impossible kind of beauty. I've never heard it myself, but I've spoken to those who swear they have. One woman from Mayo told me she heard it when her father fell ill. It was late evening and she'd stepped outside for air. The sky was the colour of ash and the wind was still. Then she heard it, faint at first, then rising. It was not loud, but it filled everything. She said it was like grief turned into sound. Her father died the next morning. She didn't fear the voice, she told me. She said it felt like a blessing, like someone had come to help him cross. The sound of sorrow is something Ireland knows well. We are a people who have lost much, through famine, through exile, through time itself. Maybe that is why the legend of the banshee endures. She is not a warning of death, but a companion to it. She reminds us that grief is a shared language, that mourning is a kind of love that refuses to fade. When I think of her voice, I imagine it carried through valleys and over rivers, threading its way between the living and the dead. A cry that is not meant to frighten, but to connect, one note held forever between worlds. Ireland is full of thin places, spots where the veil between worlds feels so slight that one could almost reach through and touch the other side. The air feels different there. The light moves strangely. Time itself seems to pause. People say that in such places the spirit world draws near. The banshee, I think, belongs entirely to that threshold. She does not live in one realm or the other. She drifts between them. Some say she comes from the fairy mounds, the old hollow hills where the Aoc still dwell. Others believe she haunts rivers and waterfalls, places where water divides the land and mirrors the sky. Wherever boundaries exist, between day and night, life and death seen and unseen, she moves freely. I once stood at such a place myself, in Connemara, where the mountains fall into lakes that seem to have no bottom. The air there feels alive. As I stood by the water, I thought of her, the woman who walks between worlds. I didn't hear a cry, only a deep stillness, the kind that makes your heart ache without knowing why. Perhaps that too was her presence. Not every haunting is sound, some are silence. In the old stories, she crosses easily from this life to the next, guiding souls who wander, keeping watch over those who are about to depart. To walk between worlds is to understand both, and the banshee seems to understand us more than we understand ourselves. She is sorrow, but she is also compassion, a bridge between what was and what will be. Sometimes I think the veil between worlds has never been as thin as it is in grief. Perhaps that is why she lingers there, where love and loss overlap. No two stories describe her the same way. In Leinster, she is a maiden dressed in white, her hair long and gold as wheat. In Munster, she is an old woman, thin and bent, her eyes red from weeping. In Ulster, she wears a dark cloak and walks barefoot through the fog. In Connaught, she appears as mist itself, a shape without edges, floating above the rivers at dusk. Each form tells us something about how people see sorrow. Some imagine grief as beautiful, some as ancient and worn. Some see it as invisible, a presence felt but not seen. The banshee reflects all these truths. She becomes whatever the heart needs her to be. Many tales mention her comb, a small shining thing she uses to smooth her long hair. To find one of these combs is said to be dangerous. To touch it is to invite her attention. But to understand it is to see the symbol behind it. The comb is memory, the act of untangling what is past, smoothing the threads of what has been. The banshee combs the years themselves, trying to keep them from knotting with pain. Her beauty, when she appears as young, is never the beauty of life, but of twilight, fading, fragile, touched by loss. When she appears as old, her face is not grotesque, but tired, kind, like someone who has cried too long for others. The banshee's faces are our faces, reflected through centuries of mourning. Each story gives her form, but none can contain her. She is grief made visible, the shape of love enduring. Night in Ireland has its own language, the cry of an owl, the whisper of wind through the hedges, the sea murmuring against the rocks. Each sound tells a story, if you listen long enough. Yet among all those voices, one sound stands apart, the wail of the banshee. It can rise suddenly, slicing through the quiet like a blade of light, or drift softly, almost too faint to catch. It may come once, or echo again and again until dawn. Those who have heard it say, it doesn't sound like anything else on earth. It is a sound that seems to carry the weight of generations, the sorrow of mothers, lovers, and the land itself. One story I heard from Kilkenny tells of a priest who heard the wail while walking home one winter night. The road was empty, the air still. The sound came from ahead of him, though there was no one in sight. It rose and fell like waves. The next morning he learned that a close friend had died suddenly. He said later that the cry didn't frighten him, but filled him with a strange calm. It was as if someone was already mourning for him, he said, and I didn't have to. That is what her call does. It takes the first sorrow upon itself so that others may grieve with less pain. It's a small mercy, but a mercy all the same. Sometimes I wonder if that is why her legend has survived for so long. The banshee's voice is not simply a warning. It is a promise that no one departs unnoticed. Her cry says, you were loved, you were seen, you will be remembered. When the night grows still and the world feels older than memory, I think she still sings, not only for the dead, but for us, who keep forgetting how to listen. Before there were funeral bells or mourning cards, there were the keeners, women who stood by the dead and sang their souls home. Their lament, the Cowie was both music and ritual, an act of deep reverence. Each cry, each note was shaped by love, by loss, by the weight of generations who had done the same before. I've heard recordings of their descendants, or women from the west of Ireland whose voices still carry that ancient ache. It is not a song you can learn. It is something that lives in the blood, an inheritance of sorrow and compassion intertwined. In many ways, the banshee is their echo, the spirit of those keeners who refused to let the art of mourning fade. When the world became too quiet, when the old ways began to vanish, perhaps one voice remained to keep the ritual alive. Her cry became the Cowie of eternity, sung for all who die and all who remember. Sometimes I imagine the first banshee as one of those women standing at a grave long ago. Maybe her voice was so full of love that even the wind paused to listen, and in that moment she crossed the threshold. No longer mortal, no longer bound by time. The Coinead became her heartbeat, and she has been singing ever since. The banshee reminds us that mourning is not weakness, it is devotion. To cry for the dead is to say, they mattered. To wail is to remember. And perhaps through her, the land itself continues to grieve for every life that has passed across it. There's a place not far from Galway where a small river winds through the bogland, quiet and silver. The locals call it a Hain na Imban Si, the river of the fairy woman. They say that on certain nights, if you walk there alone, you can hear her voice drifting over the water. I visited once on a misted evening when the light was thinning and the midges hung heavy in the air. The land felt suspended, as though the world had stopped breathing. I didn't expect to hear anything, and perhaps that's why the moment felt so strange, because the silence itself began to sound like something. Not a cry, not even a sigh, just a trembling in the air like a voice too soft to be heard. I stood by the water for a long time. There was no fear, only stillness, a feeling that something unseen was near, patient and kind. I remember thinking, if this is where the banshee walks, then she walks gently. When I left, I carried that feeling with me, that quiet reminder that grief, when it comes, does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it rests beside you like the mist, saying nothing at all. Perhaps that is the truest form of her cry, not sound but presence. The river flows on, reflecting the sky, carrying every sorrow to the sea. Maybe the banshee follows it, guiding each tear to its home. In many old Irish homes, the banshee was not a myth, but a member of the household. She was spoken of quietly, with respect, as though she might be listening from the next room. Some families claim to know her by sight. In Wexford, there's a tale of the Byrne family, whose banshee was said to appear in a veil of silver light. She never entered the house, but hovered near the window, her face pale, her lips moving as though in prayer. The family learned not to fear her. When she came, they would light a candle and leave it on the sill, a gesture of understanding between worlds. In Limerick, the O'Connells had a different kind of visitor. Their banshee was heard but never seen, her cry rising from the orchard behind their home. The sound would come in threes, never more, never less. One night, after the final cry faded, their patriarch passed away. The family later said that her voice was so beautiful, so full of sorrow, that it felt like forgiveness itself. It's strange to think of a family spirit who mourns generation after generation, who remembers what the living forget. But maybe that is her purpose, to keep memory alive when time would otherwise erase it. When I think of those families, I imagine the banshee not as a ghost, but as a guardian. She is the keeper of bloodlines, the voice of remembrance that follows them through the centuries. To be mourned by her is to never be forgotten. Not every death in Ireland comes with a wail. Sometimes the banshee's presence is quieter, more private. A sudden chill in the room, a candle that flickers for no reason, a whisper that sounds like your own name spoken softly in the dark. There are stories of travellers who felt her pass them on lonely roads, a breath of cold air brushing their faces, though the night was still. One man from Kerry told me that before his mother died, he saw a white shape near her window, motionless and calm like a shadow made of light. There was no sound, only a sense of farewell. I find those moments the most haunting, the silences where she lingers unseen. They remind me that grief is not always loud. Sometimes it is a presence that fills the air around us, too tender to speak. I've often thought that perhaps the banshee's greatest gift is not her cry, but her company. She comes when we are most alone, standing unseen beside the dying, keeping vigil when the living can no longer stay awake. She does not save, she does not heal, but she witnesses, and in that witnessing she offers dignity. Maybe that is what all souls desire at the end, not rescue, but remembrance, someone or something. To say, I see you, you mattered, you are not alone. In that quiet truth, the banshee becomes less a spirit of death and more a spirit of compassion. Ireland has always been a place of departures. We have buried too many and watched too many sail away, never to return. The soil remembers every footstep, every tear. Sometimes I think the banshee doesn't just cry for people. She cries for the land itself. The famine years left the country hollowed out. Fields that once rang with laughter grew quiet. Roads that led to villages now led only to ghosts. There are stories from that time of people hearing her voice not once, but constantly. A wailing carried on the wind from coast to coast. They said it was the land grieving, the hills themselves crying for the lives that had slipped away. Even now there are moments when I feel her near. Not as a ghost in the shadows, but as a breath in the air. The fog along the coast, the keening of gulls at dusk, the low hum of the wind through the hedgerows, all of it feels like her voice, reminding us of what has been lost. But her sorrow is not despair, it is endurance. To cry for the land is to love it still. The banshee's wail is proof that Ireland remembers every life, every story, every silence. And perhaps, when the mist curls over the hills and the night grows very still, she is still out there, standing on the edge of some forgotten field, weeping not for one soul, but for all of us. There was a time when I feared sorrow, when I thought of death as something to be hidden from, hushed or buried beneath polite silence. But the older I grow, the more I understand the banshee's lesson. Her wail is not horror, it is honesty. She does not pretend that loss is easy. She does not try to soften it. Instead, she allows it to be what it is, vast, consuming, and strangely beautiful. In her cry, Grief is neither forbidden nor forgotten. It is expressed, shared, and set free. The Irish have always known that to grieve openly is to honour the dead. That is why our wakes were filled with laughter as well as tears, why the keeners sang through the night. Grief, when shared, becomes memory, and memory, when spoken, becomes love that never dies. Sometimes I wonder if that is why she lingers near our homes and hills, to remind us not to hold our sorrow in silence. The Banshee's voice calls us to remember that mourning is sacred, that love does not end where life does. When I listen to the rain falling on the roof at night, I sometimes imagine it as 1,000 soft laments, 1,000 gentle goodbyes. Maybe that too is part of her, the endless rhythm of remembering. In the end, her cry is not for the dead alone. It is for the living, teaching us that it is all right to feel deeply, to weep when we must, and to find beauty even in the ache of loss. If you ever hear her voice, faint and far away, carried on the wind like a memory, do not run. Stand still. Listen. You might find that the sound is not frightening at all. It may feel familiar, like something you have known all your life, but forgotten how to name. It is the sound of love enduring through time, the sound of remembrance refusing to fade. I have never seen her, though I've walked the roads she's said to haunt, through bogs and valleys and silent fields. Yet I feel she has always been near, not a ghost outside, but a presence within, the part of the soul that mourns because it loves too much to let go. In the hush before dawn, when the world feels suspended and the mist curls low over the earth, I sometimes think I hear her. Not as a scream, but as a sigh, the gentle exhale of a land remembering its own heart. The Banshee's wail is the sound of Ireland itself, tender, haunted, unbroken. It tells us that sorrow is sacred, that endings are only another kind of beginning, and that every farewell carries within it a quiet promise that nothing truly loved is ever lost. And so, when night falls and the world grows still, I whisper a prayer to her. May your voice never fade. May we always listen. May we always remember.